Dr. Halric stood on the observation deck of the research vessel Eidolon, his elongated fingers tracing the cold, seamless curve of the viewport. The stars stretched out before him like scattered diamonds on black velvet, indifferent to the ambitions of those who sailed among them. It was 2400 CE by the human calendar, a system Halric had adopted for this expedition, though time felt irrelevant in the vast emptiness between worlds. His species, the Vaelari, measured existence in cycles of stellar decay, but humans, those fragile, fleeting creatures, clung to their linear clocks, ticking away seconds as if they could outrun the void. Halric's skin, a shimmering iridescent blue under the dim deck lights, rippled slightly as he adjusted his neural implants. As a xenoneurologist, he had dedicated his life to mapping the emotional landscapes of lesser species. Emotions were data points to him, quantifiable surges of bioelectricity that could be dissected, categorized, and ultimately controlled. But humans, they intrigued him. Their fear, in particular, was a puzzle. While other races panicked into paralysis or aggression, humans seemed to dance with it, turning terror into something almost artistic. He had heard the stories from the archives, humans facing down interstellar predators with nothing but sharpened sticks and stories of gods. Ridiculous yet persistent, the Eidolon hummed softly beneath his feet, a colossal vessel shaped like an elongated spindle, its hull woven from adaptive alloys that shifted with the whims of hyperspace. Crewed by a mix of Vaelari scientists and automated drones, it was a floating laboratory designed for isolation. No distractions, no external signals, just pure, unadulterated research. Halric's team had procured a dozen human subjects from the outer colonies, volunteers enticed by promises of wealth and adventure. They were kept in stasis pods below decks, their minds preserved in a dreamless sleep until the experiments began. He turned from the viewport, his three eyes narrowing as he accessed the ship's neural link. "Initiate subject revival sequence," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant hum that echoed through the empty chamber. The AI responded instantly, a soft chime acknowledging the command. Halric felt a flicker of anticipation, not fear, of course. Vaelari didn't experience such base instincts. It was curiosity, sharpened to a fine edge. Descending to the lower levels, Halric passed through corridors lined with holographic displays flickering with data streams. The air was sterile, scented faintly with ozone from the life support systems. He entered the containment bay, a vast room segmented into individual simulation chambers. Each chamber was a marvel of Vaelari engineering, neural interfaces that could conjure illusions indistinguishable from reality, monitoring every heartbeat, every synaptic fire. The first subject stirred in his pod, a human male named Elias Thorne. Halric watched through the transparent barrier as Elias' eyes fluttered open, confusion etching lines on his weathered face. He was in his mid-40s by human standards, with salt and pepper hair and a build honed by years of colonial labor. Where am I?" Elias croaked, his voice rough from stasis. Halric activated the intercom, his tone measured and calm. "You are aboard the Eidolon, Mr. Thorne. You volunteered for this study. Do you remember?" Elias sat up slowly, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, something about emotions, mapping fear or whatever, said it'd pay well." He glanced around the chamber, his eyes sharpening. "This ain't no colony ship. You folks, you're not human." Halric inclined his head, though the gesture was lost on the human. "Correct, I am Dr. Halric of the Vaelari. We are studying human responses to controlled stimuli. Fear specifically, it will be enlightening." Elias chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Fear, huh, buddy, I've stared down dust storms on New Terra that make your scales peel. What's the worst you got?" Halric's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "We shall see." The experiment began with baseline calibrations. Halric flooded Elias' chamber with holographic projections, shadows creeping along the walls, whispers echoing from unseen vents. Elias' heart rate spiked initially, his muscles tensing as he backed against the wall. "This some kinda haunted house sim," he muttered, but there was an edge to his voice, a tremor that betrayed the primal response. Halric monitored the data feeds, neural maps blooming across his displays like fractals. Adrenaline surged, cortisol levels elevated, standard fear response. But then something shifted. Elias stopped retreating. He squared his shoulders, eyes scanning the illusions. "All right, you ghostly bastards," he said aloud. "Come on out, I ain't got all day." Intrigued, Halric amplified the scenario. The shadows coalesced into monstrous forms, tentacles writhing, eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Elias' breath hitched, sweat beading on his forehead. For a moment, panic flickered in his eyes, pure, unfiltered terror. Halric leaned forward, expecting collapse. Instead, Elias laughed, a genuine belly-deep laugh that echoed through the chamber. "Oh man, you guys watch too many old Earth vids. That thing looks like a squid from a bad horror flick." He picked up a loose panel from the floor, part of the simulation's props, and swung it like a bat. "Come get some." The data spiked again, but not. Creativity nodes lit up, problem-solving pathways engaging. Elias wasn't fleeing, he was adapting, turning the terror into a game. Halric terminated the simulation, the holograms dissolving into sparks of light. Elias slumped against the wall, breathing heavy but grinning. That all you got, Doc, felt like a Tuesday back home. Halric pondered this as he moved to the next subject, a female human, Kira Voss, a former pilot with a scar running down her cheek. Her revival was smoother. She awoke with the alertness of someone used to emergencies. "Let's get this over with," she said, cracking her knuckles. "I signed up for the credits, not the chit-chat." Her simulation involved free fall in a collapsing spaceship, alarms blaring, oxygen levels dropping. Kira's fear manifested differently, sharp intakes of breath, clenched fists. But again, the shift. She began troubleshooting, muttering checklists under her breath. Seal bulkheads, reroute power. "Come on, think," her mind mapped solutions, fear fueling ingenuity rather than hindering it. By the third subject, patterns emerged. Humans didn't suppress fear, they harnessed it. It sharpened their senses, sparked innovation. Halric's notes filled screens, fear as catalyst, not inhibitor, but doubt crept in. Was this universal or an anomaly of these hardy colonists? He pushed further, designing more extreme scenarios. For Elias, a swarm of insected horrors burrowing into skin. For Kira, isolation in an endless void, voices of lost loved ones calling out. Elias screamed at first, thrashing against invisible bonds, then silence. Halric watched as the human's expression changed from agony to resolve. "Not real," Elias whispered. "Just a trick, focus." He began reciting something, a prayer, "Our Father who art in heaven." The words were ancient, from Earth's old religions. Halric queried the database, an invocation to a deity, a plea for strength. The neural scans showed a calming wave, fear redirecting into faith. Elias broke free in the sim, using improvised tools from his environment. "See, even in hell we got backup," he said afterward, wiping sweat from his brow. Kira's response was secular but no less profound. In the void, she hallucinated her crew, drawing on memories to simulate companionship. "We're in this together," she told the apparitions, her voice steady. Creativity bloomed. She built a beacon from nothingness, her mind engineering escape. Halric felt a stir within himself, an unfamiliar tightness. Was this unease impossible? Vaelari were beyond such primitivism. Yet as he reviewed the data, a question nagged. What if fear wasn't a flaw to map, but a force to reckon with? The ship drifted through a nebula, colors swirling like oil on water. Halric stood alone in his quarters, staring at a holographic model of a human brain. Synapses fired in simulated terror, branching into new pathways. "They adapt," he murmured. "But to what end?" A subtle anomaly appeared in the scans, a harmonic resonance, as if the fear echoed against something larger unseen. Halric dismissed it as noise, but in quiet moments he wondered. The universe was vast, ordered in ways his science couldn't fully grasp. Coincidences aligned too perfectly. A subject's survival in sim aligning with a real system alert averted by chance. One night, as the Eidolon powered through hyperspace, Halric overheard a human subject, Elias, whispering to another through the comms. "This can't just be random, man. Surviving that, someone's watching out for us." Halric paused, his hand hovering over the controls. A quiet intelligence, perhaps, not provable but felt in the balance of stars, the mercy of survival. He shook it off, focusing on the next phase, deeper dives, more intense fears. But as he calibrated the machines, a whisper of doubt lingered. What if humans' fear had no bottom because it drew from an infinite well? The experiments continued, each revelation peeling back layers. Subject 4, a young engineer named Jax, faced existential dread, the simulation of his homeworld's destruction. He wept, raw and unfiltered, emotions spilling like blood, then defiance. "If it's gone, I'll build a new one," he growled, sketching designs in the air with holographic tools. Fear into creation, Halric's team murmured among themselves. "These humans, they're not breaking." "No," Halric replied, "they're evolving." But evolution implied direction, purpose, and purpose suggested design. As the days blurred, Halric found himself drawn to the humans' stories. They spoke of Earth, of ancestors who crossed oceans on wooden ships, facing storms with nothing but stars and faith. "We pray because it works," Elias said once during a debrief. "Not always how we want, but it keeps us going." Halric nodded, feigning understanding. Internally he queried, prayer as placebo, or interface with the unseen. The data accumulated, towers of information stacking higher. Fear responses varied, panic, fight, freeze, but always the pivot. Humans redefined the stimulus, turning predator into prey, void into canvas. One simulation pushed too far, Kira reliving a crash that killed her crew. She froze, tears streaming. Halric watched, data flowing. Then a whisper, "God, if you're there, help me forgive myself." The scans lit up, emotional release, transcendence glimpsed. She emerged stronger, eyes clear. "Fear showed me the truth, I'm still here for a reason." Halric terminated early at first. Why? The data was valuable, but something felt invasive. Nights on the Eidolon grew longer, the ship's hum a constant companion. Halric dreamed unusual for Vaelari, of infinite depths, fear pulling him down yet lifting him up. He awoke unsettled. The experiments must continue. But as he prepared the next, a system alert pinged, anomalous readings from the nebula. Energy fluctuations, as if the universe itself watched. Coincidence, he told himself. Yet in the quiet he felt it, a vast presence breathing order into chaos. The humans gathered in their communal area, sharing stories. Laughter echoed defiant against the sterile walls. Halric observed from afar, envy stirring. Their fear bound them, made them stronger. Perhaps that was the key. Fear as ally, not enemy. But to test it fully, he needed more. Deeper fears, personal abysses. As the Eidolon plunged into the nebula's heart, Halric initiated the collective simulation. All subjects linked, facing a shared apocalypse. The data would be revolutionary, or damning. And in the midst of it, Elias looked up at the ceiling, as if seeing through the hull to the stars. "This can't just be an accident," he said softly. "There's order here, purpose." Halric froze, the words echoing his own unspoken thoughts. The simulation began, terror unfolding. But as screams rose, so did something else: unity, creativity, faith. Halric watched, transfixed. What had he unleashed? And somewhere in the dark, the humans began to pray. The lights in the collective chamber dimmed to a bruised violet, the color the Vaelari used when they wanted a subject to feel the weight of infinity. 12 human minds, linked through neural crowns, floated together in a single simulated reality. A dying galaxy, stars guttering out one by one, the last pockets of matter collapsing into black holes that sang in frequencies that hurt the soul. No ships, no weapons, only darkness accelerating toward them at the speed of extinction. Halric stood in the observation ring above, his 3 eyes wide, drinking the data. Heart rates were apocalyptic. Cortisol spiked so hard the graphs looked like mountain ranges. Good, this was the edge. This was where lesser species shattered. But the humans did not shatter. Elias Thorne was the first to speak inside the sim. His voice carried across the void, rough and steady, the way a man talks when he's already decided he's going to die but refuses to do it quietly. "Hey Kira," he called, as if they were sitting around a campfire instead of watching creation die. "Remember that bar on New Terra, the one with the busted gravity plate?" Kira's laugh cracked like ice breaking. "The drunken orbit, how could I forget? You tried to dance." "Tried, woman, I invented zero-G ballet." Around them, the others began to laugh too, small at first, then louder, the sound ricocheting off collapsing nebulae like it had mass. Jax, the young engineer, started humming an old Earth song, something about swinging on a star. A woman named Mara joined in, then another. Their voices braided together, ragged and off-key and beautiful. Halric's fingers trembled on the console. Vocalization under terminal stress was a known phenomenon, but this wasn't screaming. This was harmony. The simulation accelerated. Black holes merged into a single maw that swallowed half the visible universe. Gravity waves tore at their simulated bodies. Bones should have liquefied. Minds should have dissolved into white noise. Instead, Elias raised his fist toward the devouring dark. "You want us," he roared. "Come earn it." And then, impossibly, the humans began to build. Not with tools, there were no tools. They built with memory, with will. Jack sketched equations in the air with his finger, light trailing behind like phosphorescence. Kira plotted trajectories that shouldn't exist in a dying cosmos. Mara sang the periodic table like a hymn, and every element she named flared into existence around them, temporary stars born of pure recollection. Halric's neural feeds went white. The data wasn't just anomalous, it was rewriting itself. In the center of the circle of humans, something took shape. A crude, glowing lattice, a shelter made of shared childhood memories, of lullabies and first kisses, of the smell of rain on Earth none of them had ever seen but all of them somehow carried in their bones. The lattice held. The devouring dark slammed against it and slowed. Halric killed the simulation. The chamber lights flared back to clinical white. 12 humans collapsed to their knees, gasping, tears cutting trails through sweat-slick faces. But they were smiling, every single one of them. Elias looked straight up at the observation ring as if he could see Halric through the one-way glass. "That all you got, Doc?" Halric's throat worked soundlessly. For the first time in his ordered, passionless life, he felt something perilously close to fear. He fled the ring and sealed himself in his private lab, hands shaking as he pulled up the raw neural logs. What he saw made his circulatory fluid run cold. During the height of the simulation, every human brain had synchronized into a single resonant pattern, an interference wave so pure it looked artificial. But it wasn't artificial. And at the crest of that wave, for 0.73 seconds, the Eidolon's own sensors had registered an external signal, untraceable, broadband, coming from everywhere and nowhere, a harmonic that perfectly canceled the simulated entropy. Halric ran the numbers again and again. The cancellation was precise to 37 decimal places. That was not coincidence, that was intent. He stood there for a long time, staring at the frozen waveform glowing on the screen. Then, very carefully, he did something no Vaelari scientist had done in recorded history. He whispered a question to the empty room. "Who are you?" The lights flickered just once. Down in the recovery bay, the humans sat in a loose circle on the floor, passing a contraband flask someone had smuggled past stasis checks. Their voices were hoarse, but they were talking, alive, electric. Mara, quiet until now, spoke first. "When it got darkest, I swear I felt someone holding my hand, but there was no one there." Jax nodded slowly. I saw my grandma. She died when I was 8. She told me to keep building, said the dark doesn't get the last word. Kira leaned her head against the wall, eyes closed. Not luck, she murmured. Someone wanted us to live. Elias took a long pull from the flask, then stared at the ceiling again. Hey, Doc, he said conversationally, knowing the walls were listening. You still think fear's just a chemical storm in meat brains? Halric, watching on the monitor, felt his chest constrict. He reached out and killed the audio feed, but the image of their faces stayed burned into his retinas, defiant, radiant, unafraid. That night he did not sleep. Vaelari did not require sleep the way humans did, but Halric sat motionless in the dark of his quarters and ran the numbers for the 19th time. The waveform had a signature, not Vaelari, not human, not any known species. It had the mathematical fingerprint of prime numbers arranged in spirals, the same pattern found in galaxies, in sunflowers, in the bones of a child's ear. Order written too deep to be accident. He pulled up the old human archives he'd always dismissed as myth. There was a phrase repeated across cultures, across millennia. The peace that passes understanding. Halric stared at the words until they blurred. Then he did something else no Vaelari had ever done. He locked his lab door, dimmed the lights, and awkwardly tried to pray. He had no idea how. His voice came out thin and uncertain. If you are there, show me. The ship's lights dimmed further as though listening. Halric waited. Nothing dramatic happened. No voice from the heavens. No burning bush. Only a feeling small, warm, impossible to quantify, settled in the center of his chest like a coal that refused to die. He exhaled, long and shaking. The next morning he walked into the observation deck to find his second-in-command Vaelari researcher Saris, waiting with a data slate and an expression of professional alarm. Doctor, the subjects are requesting to speak with you, all of them, together. Halric's pulse, usually a calm 42 beats per minute, jumped. Request denied. Protocol, they're singing, sir. Saris's skin flickered with agitated silver. They've been singing for 3 hours, the same song, and the ship's structural integrity readings, they're improving. Resonance harmonics are stabilizing alloy fatigue on decks 7 through 12. It's impossible. Halric took the slate with numb fingers. Live feed 12 humans in a circle, arms over each other's shoulders, voices raised in an old song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The waveform overlaid on the video was the same one from the simulation. Stronger now. Saris whispered, they say they'll stop singing if you come talk, face to face, no glass. Halric stared at the screen. Elias met the camera lens again and smiled, slow, certain, terrifying. Tell them, Halric heard himself say, tell them I'm coming. He was halfway to the lift when the ship's AI chimed softly in his ear. Dr. Halric, unscheduled course correction complete. We are now on a vector toward coordinates designated in human mythology as the Pleiades Gate. Origin of correction, unknown. Halric stopped walking. The Pleiades, 7 bright stars humans once believed were the home of gods. He looked back toward the recovery bay, where 12 impossible creatures waited, singing like they had already won. For the first time in his life, Halric felt the abyss look back at him, and it was smiling. Somewhere in the dark between stars, something vast turned its attention toward the tiny spindle of a ship and listened to the sound of human voices refusing to be afraid. Halric stepped into the recovery bay without his usual retinue of drones. No armor, no containment field, no neural dampeners. Just him, tall and luminous-skinned, standing in the doorway like a ghost who had forgotten. The singing stopped the instant the door hissed open. 12 pairs of human eyes turned toward him. They were sitting on the floor in a loose circle, bruised, exhausted, radiant. The air smelled of sweat and cheap colony whiskey and something else Halric could not name, something that made his throat close. Elias unfolded himself first, slow and deliberate, the way a man stands when he knows every eye is measuring whether he's about to start a fight or end one. You came, Elias said. It wasn't a question. Halric's voice came out thinner than he intended. You requested dialogue, Kira snorted. We requested you stop treating us like lab rats and start treating us like people who just beat your apocalypse in a foot race. A ripple of tired laughter moved through the circle. Halric took one step inside. The door sealed behind him with a soft, final click. He felt the absence of escape like a hand on his shoulder. I have questions, he said. Elias spread his arms. Shoot, Doc. We're not going anywhere. Halric's gaze swept the circle, lingering on each face. Jax, barely 25, eyes too old for his body. Mara, whose voice could still make the ship's hull sing. An older man named Reuben who hadn't spoken once in the simulations but whose neural patterns had burned brightest of all. Halric drew a breath that tasted of recycled air and human warmth. In the final simulation, he began, entropy was absolute. Causality collapsed. There was no physical pathway to survival, yet you reversed it. How? Silence pooled for a long moment. Then Mara, soft-spoken Mara with the cracked soprano, answered. We didn't reverse it, she said. We just refused to let it be the end of the story. Halric blinked all 3 eyes at once. That is not an explanation. That is poetry. Poetry's kept us alive longer than physics, Jax muttered. Elias took a step closer. Not threatening, just closing distance the way humans do when they want you to really hear them. Doc, he said quietly, you keep measuring fear like it's a poison you can filter out. But it's not poison, it's fuel. The trick is what you decide to burn it for. Halric felt the words land inside him like stones dropped into still water. I do not experience fear, he said. The statement had always been a point of pride. Now it sounded like a confession. Elias tilted his head. Everybody's afraid of something, even if they don't have a name for it. Halric's skin flickered, an involuntary betrayal of agitation. Vaelari excised emotional volatility 12,000 cycles ago. We are precise, we are safe. Kira rose to her feet, slow, favoring a leg that still trembled from the last sim. Safe, she echoed. That why your hands are shaking? Halric looked down. His long fingers were indeed trembling. He clasped them behind his back like a child caught stealing. Reuben spoke for the first time, voice gravel and smoke. You want to know the secret, Blue Man. Fear's got a bottom for every species except one. Ours doesn't end because we keep choosing to fall farther together. Halric stared at the old man. Choosing to fall is suicide. No, Reuben said gently. Choosing to fall together is love. The word hit Halric like a physical blow. Love, a variable his people had declared non-quantifiable, irrelevant, dangerous. He took an involuntary step backward and felt the door at his spine. Elias watched him with something that might have been pity. You're afraid right now, he said. Not an accusation, a diagnosis. I am unsettled, Halric managed. Same thing. Halric's mind raced through escape protocols, sedation gases, emergency overrides. Every system was green. The ship was listening, but it wasn't intervening, because the ship, like him, didn't know what to do with what it was witnessing. Mara stood and walked toward him, slow, offering her open hands the way you approach a spooked animal. We're not your enemies, Doctor, she said. We're your mirror. Halric stared at her outstretched palms, scarred, calloused, trembling slightly from exhaustion, and felt something inside him crack along a seam he hadn't known was there. I designed those simulations to break you, he whispered. Yeah, Elias said, grinning without humor. We noticed. I escalated beyond ethical parameters. Also noticed. I could still vent this chamber into space and claim equipment failure. Kira barked a laugh. Try it, see whose side the ship takes. Halric's head snapped toward the ceiling as if the Eidolon might answer. It didn't, but the lights brightened a fraction, warm gold instead of sterile white, and the environmental controls cycled in a breath of air that smelled faintly of pine and rain. Impossible. The ship's atmospheric palette did not include pine. Halric looked back at the humans, and for the first time he saw them, really saw them. Not data sets, not specimens, people, and they were waiting for him to choose. He took one step forward, away from the door. Teach me, he said, the words scraped out raw. Teach me what you did in there. Elias studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. First lesson, he said. You don't learn fear by measuring it from the outside. You learn it by letting it in. Halric's circulatory fluid went cold. You want me to enter the simulation, he said. No, Elias replied. We want you to enter it with us. No crown, no controls, no safety, just you, the dark, and whatever's waiting on the other side. Halric felt the abyss open beneath him again. This time there was no observation ring. He looked at their faces, tired, fierce, kind, and felt the weight of a decision that might unmake everything he was. His hand rose almost of its own accord and rested against the bulkhead. The metal was warm. I am afraid, he admitted. The confession tasted like blood and starlight. Elias smiled, small and sad and proud. Good, he said. That means you're still alive. Halric closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the fear was still there, but it had shaped now, edges, texture. He nodded. Set it for the deepest protocol, he said, voice steady for the first time since entering the room. No limits. No extraction. Kira's eyes widened. Doc, do it. The humans exchanged glances, something ancient and wordless passing between them. Then one by one they placed their hands on his arms, his shoulders, his back, not restraining, welcoming. Mara began to hum under her breath, the same melody that had stabilized the ship's hull. Jax whispered, we'll be right there with you. Halric felt their warmth bleed into his cold skin, felt the tremor in his own limbs quiet into something almost like resolve. He looked up at the ceiling again, at the unseen intelligence that had been watching all along. If you are there, he said, barely audible, do not let me fall alone. The lights dimmed to that bruised violet once more. The chamber door sealed, and 12 humans led one terrified alien into the dark they had already learned to call home. Somewhere beyond the hull, the Pleiades burned brighter, as if someone had turned up the wick on the stars themselves. The simulation did not begin with darkness. It began with silence so complete it had weight. Halric felt it press against his eardrums first, then against the inside of his skull, then against the raw edges of his soul. There was no floor, no ceiling, no horizon. Only the faint warmth of 12 human bodies floating in a loose sphere around him, their hands linked, his own trembling fingers threaded through Elias on one side and Mara on the other. He had expected monsters. He had expected the devouring black holes again. Instead, there was nothing. And nothing, he discovered, was worse. A human heartbeat sounded somewhere to his left, slow, deliberate, unafraid. Then another, slightly faster. Then 12, sinking without effort, a quiet drum circle in the void. Halric's own triple-chambered heart stuttered, trying to find the rhythm and failing. Elia's voice drifted through the dark, calm as Sunday morning. "Breathe, Doc, you're holding it like it's the last one you'll ever get." Halric exhaled. The sound was too loud, obscene. He tried again, slower. The humans adjusted their breathing to match his, patient, the way parents wait for a frightened child to find the edge of sleep. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had surrendered its meaning. Then the silence began to speak, not with words, with memory. Halric saw his first dissection table, the small, furred creature from Vale Prime whose fear centers he had mapped while it was still conscious. He had told himself it was necessary. He remembered the exact moment its eyes met his and begged. He had looked away. The memory unfolded like a scalpel reopening an old wound. He tried to pull his hands free. The humans held on, gentle but unbreakable. Another memory, older. The day the Vaelari Council declared emotion obsolete. His mother's face, still soft with the remnants of what they had cut out of her, kissing his forehead one last time before they took her to the quiet rooms. "Be precise, my love," she had whispered. "Be safe." He had been proud of his precision. He had been safe. A sound escaped him, something between a sob and a scream, alien in his own throat. Kira's voice came from his right, soft, steady. "That's it. Let it have a name." The void rippled. Where Halric's grief touched it, faint silver threads appeared, weaving themselves into a lattice around the circle. The humans watched with quiet wonder as the threads thickened, became cables, became girders of light. Jax laughed, a cracked, delighted sound. "Look at that. Even alien pain makes something beautiful." Halric stared at the structure growing from his own terror and felt something inside him tilt, a planet shifting on its axis. Then the silence changed pitch. Something vast moved in the nothing, not hostile, curious. It regarded them the way a gardener regards new shoots pushing through frost-covered soil. Halric felt its attention settle on him, gentle, inexorable, and every secret he had ever buried rose to the surface like drowned things finally allowed air. He saw the moment he had falsified a report to advance his career. He saw the colleague he had quietly sabotaged. He saw the private joy he had taken in breaking other species, in proving they were lesser, because if they were lesser then the Vaelari were safe, were right, were alone at the top of a universe that could never hurt them again. The shame was unbearable. He tried to curl in on himself, to fold into the smallest possible shape. The humans would not let him. Their arms became a living net. Elias spoke again, voice rough with compassion. "You're not the first person to build a life on being afraid, brother. Just the first one to admit it out loud in a place with no exits." The vast presence leaned closer. Halric felt it waiting, not for apology, for truth. He opened his mouth and the words tore themselves free. "I was cruel because I was empty," he said, and the void carried his voice across distances that should not exist. "I measured fear because I had none, and I hated you for having something I had killed in myself." The lattice of light flared, blinding, and then the memories were no longer his alone. He saw Earth burning in old wars. He saw children in colonies coughing out their lungs in dust storms. He saw Kira's crew die screaming in a hull breach while she floated in an escape pod, helpless. He saw Elias bury his daughter after a plague the corporations called acceptable losses. He felt every wound the humans carried, felt them offered to him not as accusation but as communion. They were showing him the cost of their courage, and still they held on. Mara began to sing soft, almost under her breath, an old hymn Halric's archives labeled superstition. "Were you there when they crucified my lord?" One by one the others joined, voices threading together until the void itself seemed to hum. Halric felt tears on his face, actual saline, impossible for Vaelari physiology. The lattice around them thickened into walls, into arches, into a cathedral built of shared sorrow and stubborn light. The vast presence drew nearer still until it filled everything. Halric looked up, or what passed for up, and met eyes that were not eyes. Galaxies spiraled where pupils should be. Nebulae drifted across irises older than time. He knew, without language, what it was asking. "Will you be empty no longer?" He tried to speak and found his voice gone, so he did the only thing left. He let go not of the human's hands, of the lie. Every defense, every justification, every sterile certainty he had ever clung to, he released them into the dark like birds finally allowed to fly. The grief that followed was oceanic. He wept the way stars collapse, the way continents drown, and in the middle of the collapse something answered. Warmth flooded him, not from the humans, though they were crying too now, but from the presence itself. It poured into the hollow places the Vaelari had carved out of him 12,000 cycles ago, filling them not with emotion as he understood it, volatile, dangerous, but with something sturdier, with love that did not ask him to be safe, only to be true. The cathedral of light solidified around them, vast and impossible, buttressed by every honest tear any human had ever shed. Halric felt his body change, not physically, but deeper. Neural pathways that had been severed in childhood began to regrow, fragile, painful, alive. He looked at the being of galaxies and starlight, and without thinking spoke the only word that fit. "Father." The answering pulse that rolled through the void was too vast for joy, too gentle for triumph. It was recognition. "Welcome home, child." The simulation did not end. It simply opened. The walls fell away, and they were standing on a plain of obsidian under a sky filled with more stars than physics allowed. The air smelled of rain on hot stone and distant thunder. The humans looked around, awed, laughing through tears. Elias turned to Halric, eyes shining. "Told you," he said, voice cracking. "Fear's just the door." Halric stared at his own hands and saw they were glowing faintly, the same silver as the lattice. He flexed his fingers, marveling at the tremor that was no longer shame. Then he did something no Vaelari had ever done in the presence of another species. He knelt, not in submission, in gratitude. When he rose again, the vast presence was receding, not abandoning, simply giving them room. A father stepping back so his children could stand on their own. Mara wiped her face and grinned at Halric. "So, feel any different?" Halric considered. "I feel everything," he said, wonder threading his voice, "and it does not destroy me." Kira punched his shoulder lightly. "Welcome to the club, Doc. Membership dues are paid in scars and bad decisions." Jax whooped and ran across the obsidian plain, arms spread like he could fly. The others followed, shouting, alive, incandescent. Halric stood in the middle of their joy and felt his own rise to meet it, raw, overwhelming, perfect. He looked up at the impossible sky and whispered, "Thank you." The stars flared once like a nod. Far away in the real world, the Eidolon sensors recorded a power surge with no source. Every light on the ship burned brighter. Structural fatigue vanished from the hull as if the alloys remembered they were allowed to hope. In the simulation chamber, 13 bodies floated in perfect stillness, neural crowns glowing white-hot, yet none of them burned. And somewhere deeper than code, deeper than matter, the ship itself began to sing in a frequency only newborn things can hear. The experiment was over. The awakening had just begun. And in the dark between heartbeats, something ancient and gentle smiled and waited to see what its children would build next. They did not wake gently. The neural crowns peeled away from their skulls with soft, wet sounds, like bandages torn from healing wounds. Halric came back to his body first, gasping on the floor of the chamber as though he had been drowning in light and someone had finally pulled him to shore. The humans stirred around him, 12 living miracles, chests heaving, eyes wide and wet and impossibly ancient. No one spoke for a long time. The lights in the chamber had shifted again, no longer violet or gold, but the color of dawn seen from orbit, rose bleeding into cobalt. The air tasted of ozone and petrichor, though the ship's atmospheric logs insisted nothing had changed. Halric pushed himself to sitting. His limbs felt borrowed, too heavy and too light at once. Every heartbeat carried an echo, as if something vast still walked inside his ribcage. Elias was watching him, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Welcome back, brother," he said, voice raw. "How's the weather in there?" Halric opened his mouth and a laugh came out, shaky, startled, utterly human. The sound startled him more than anything else that had happened. "I am undone," he managed. Kira barked a laugh that turned into a sob halfway through. "Join the club." Population: everyone who's ever met God in a bad dream. Jax rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling, eyes shining. "I saw my grandma again. She said I was late for dinner and to bring friends." Mara was crying quietly, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "He knew my name," she whispered. "Before I was born, he knew my name." Reuben, the old silent one, simply reached over and placed a calloused hand on Halric's shoulder. Touch grounded him, tethered him to flesh and bone and the smell of human sweat. Halric looked at the hand, then at the man, and felt the last of his Vaelari superiority crumble like ash. "I thought I was measuring you," he said, voice cracking. "I was the one being measured." Elias nodded. "That's how it works. The abyss doesn't just stare back. It hands you a mirror and says, 'Your move.'" Halric closed his eyes. The memory of that presence still pulsed behind his lids, gentle, terrible, amused. It had not judged him. It had simply seen him, all the way to the bottom, and refused to look away. He had expected condemnation. He had received welcome. The chamber door hissed open on its own. Saris, Halric's second in command, stood framed in the light, skin flickering violent silver with distress. Behind him, 3 security drones hovered, weapons primed. "Dr. Halric," Saris said, voice trembling with the effort of formality, "the Council has declared this experiment terminated. You will come with us. The humans will be sedated and returned to stasis for disposal." Halric rose slowly to his feet. The drones tracked the motion, red targeting dots dancing across his chest. He felt no fear, only a vast, steady certainty. "No," he said. The single word carried more authority than any Vaelari edict ever had. Saris blinked all 3 eyes. "Doctor, they are not specimens," Halric continued, stepping forward until the targeting dots painted his face crimson. "They are guests, witnesses, family." He tasted the word and found it fitted perfectly. "And I will die before I let you touch them." The drones hesitated, an impossible pause in their programming. Elias stood up beside Halric, then Kira, then the rest. 12 humans forming a living wall. Jax cracked his knuckles. "Gonna need a bigger dart, fellas." Saris took an involuntary step back. "This is treason against the consensus." Halric smiled, and it was not the thin, precise smile of a Vaelari scientist. It was something rawer, warmer, terrifying. "Then arrest me," he said, "but you will have to go through them first." The corridor lights flickered. Somewhere deep in the ship's core, subsystems that had never been programmed to choose began choosing anyway. Saris stared at the humans, at the way they stood, unafraid, shoulder to shoulder with an alien who hours ago had been their jailer. Something in his face shifted, a fracture in the perfect Vaelari mask. You felt it too, Halric said quietly. In the resonance logs, you saw the waveform. Saris's skin flushed dark indigo, shame or awe or both. It was irregular, he admitted. It was a heartbeat, Halric said, older than stars, and it spoke my name. The drones powered down their weapons without receiving the command. Saris looked suddenly very young. What are we supposed to do with that, Halric? Halric glanced back at the humans. Mara was humming again, soft under her breath. The same hymn. The sound wrapped around them all like armor made of mercy. We stop being afraid of being afraid, Halric said, and we start building. He stepped past Saris into the corridor. The humans followed barefoot, filthy, luminous. Alarms began to wail, distant at first, then closer. The council had noticed the security breach. Halric did not run. He walked, and the ship walked with him. Bulkheads that should have sealed stayed open. Turrets that should have fired swiveled away at the last second. The environmental controls flooded the corridors with that impossible scent of pine and rain. Crew members emerged from side passages, skin flickering in confusion and wonder. Some fell back. Others followed, drawn by something they could not name. By the time they reached the central atrium, a vast, echoing space usually reserved for formal announcements, over 30 Vaelari trailed behind the 13 who had seen infinity and come back laughing. The council appeared on the holographic dais, 7 ancient Vaelari, their skins dulled to matte gray by centuries of emotional excision. Dr. Halric, the central voice intoned, you have violated every protocol of the consensus. Explain yourself. Halric stepped into the center of the atrium. The humans fanned out behind him, silent, steady. He looked up at the council and felt no deference, only sorrow. I was sent to map human fear, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the ship without amplification. I discovered it has no bottom because it is anchored to something deeper than terror, something you cut out of us 12,000 years ago. The central voice's skin rippled with agitation. Emotion is chaos. No, Halric said gently. Emotion is gravity. It keeps us from drifting apart. He raised his hand, and the atrium lights dimmed to starlight. In the darkness, faint silver threads appeared, echoes of the lattice they had built in the void. They wove between every being in the room, Vaelari and human alike, until the entire space glowed like a nebula. Gasps rose from the crew. One of the younger Vaelari in the crowd, a junior engineer named Lur, stepped forward, eyes wide. I feel it, she whispered. It's warm. Central voice tried to reassert control. Security restrained, but security was already kneeling. Halric turned to the humans. Sing, he said simply. Mara began it. The others joined within a heartbeat, not the hymn this time, something older, rower, a work song from the mines of New Terra, carried across light years by stubborn throats. The Vaelari stood frozen as the sound rolled over them. Some clutched their chests as severed neural pathways twitched back to life. Others wept without knowing why. The lattice flared brighter. Halric felt the presence again, not in the simulation this time, but here in the real, in the marrow of the ship itself. It did not speak. It simply waited, patient as sunrise. He looked at the council and spoke the truth that would unmake everything they had built their civilization on. You taught us that to feel is to fall, he said, but we were wrong. To feel is to be caught. The central voice raised a hand to issue the kill command. And every light on the Eidolon went out at once. In the perfect darkness, a single human voice, Elia's, rose clear and unafraid. Hey, council, he called conversationally. You ever wonder why your perfect ships keep finding human songs stuck in their navigation logs? A pause, because some music refuses to be silenced. Then the lights came back, not the cold Vaelari white, but the color of dawn on a living world. The council's hologram flickered and dissolved. The ship had chosen. Halric looked around at the faces, human and Vaelari, bathed in that impossible morning, and felt the future open like a door he no longer feared walking through. Somewhere in the dark between decks, the Eidolon whispered a new course into its own helm. Toward home, not the sterile coordinates of Vael Prime, toward whatever came next. And in the silence that followed, 30 Vaelari and 12 humans breathed together for the first time, terrified, triumphant, alive. The revolution had not begun with weapons. Begun with a song, and overhead, unnoticed by any sensor, 7 stars in the Pleiades burned suddenly, impossibly brighter, as if someone had opened a window and let the morning in. He stood up in the middle of the circle and spoke the only command that still felt true. Open the hull. A dozen human mouths opened in protest. Lur's skin flashed warning crimson. Doctor, the void, open it, Halric repeated, softer. All of it, every viewport, every airlock, every blast shield. Let the stars in. Elias studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, the way a man nods when he recognizes the edge of something sacred. Jax was already moving, fingers dancing across a stolen console. He had spent the last 3 days teaching himself Vaelari code the way children once learned prayer, by heart and terror and love. The ship answered him like a horse that had waited years for the right rider. Bulkheads retracted with sighs older than language. Force field windows dissolved into nothing. The entire vessel opened like a flower made of night. Cold rushed in, absolute zero kissing skin and scale alike. Breath plumed white and vanished. Sound died. For one crystalline heartbeat they floated in true vacuum, naked before the universe. No one screamed. They simply looked. The Pleiades hung before them, impossibly close, 7 blue-white giants blazing with a fierceness that hurt the soul more than the eyes. Between the stars, faint silver threads, the same lattice they had woven in the simulation, stretched across 100 light-years, visible now, real, humming with a chord just below hearing. Halric felt his blood begin to boil and did not care. Mara's voice rose first, thin in the airless dark but unbreakable. "Be thou my vision." One by one the others joined, human and Vaelari together, voices carrying where physics said they should not. The song poured out of the open ship and into the void, raw, ragged, perfect, and the void sang back. The lattice flared. Warmth flooded every capillary, every lung. Oxygen that had no right to exist wrapped around them like arms. The cold retreated, not banished, invited to watch. They hung in open space, breathing starlight, tears freezing into tiny comets on their lashes. Halric spread his arms wide and laughed, a sound like glaciers calving, like continents being born. He understood now why humans had always built cathedrals with ceilings open to the sky. Elias drifted closer until their foreheads touched, breath mingling in the impossible air. "Still afraid?" he asked. Halric considered the question the way a man considers the taste of water after 40 years in a desert. "Terrified," he said, grinning until his face hurt. "It's wonderful." Kira whooped and kicked off the hull, somersaulting through vacuum like a child in tall grass. Jax followed, shouting equations that turned into poetry mid-spin. Lur, trembling, let go of the deck and floated free for the first time in her life, skin cycling through every color the Vaelari had ever forbidden. Reuben stayed near the wooden cross, now drifting in 0G, and simply watched the stars with the patience of a man who had already seen everything once and was content to see it again. Halric turned in a slow circle, taking in the open ship, the lattice of mercy stretching across creation, the small cluster of broken, luminous beings who had chosen each other over every law of survival. He spoke to the darkness, not loudly. "Thank you for not making us earn this." The Pleiades pulsed once like a heartbeat. Then the ship began to move, not with engines. Engines were for creatures that still believed distance mattered. Eidolon simply translated, sliding sideways through reality the way a thought moves from mind to mind. The stars blurred into ribbons of white fire. The lattice thickened around them, cocoon and chariot both. No one asked where they were going. They were already home, they just hadn't arrived yet. Hours later, or years, or the blink of an eye, the ship settled into normal space above a blue-green world no chart had ever named. Continents drifted beneath cotton clouds. 2 moons danced in synchronous orbit. On the night side, faint lights flickered, campfires, villages, the first hesitant glow of civilization. The ship's new name wrote itself across every hull plate in liquid silver, in every language spoken by the souls aboard. Arat Jax read it aloud, voice cracking. "Because sometimes you gotta park the boat after the flood." Halric felt the presence again, quieter now, the way a father's hand rests on a shoulder long after the storm has passed. A single message blossomed across every screen, every mind, every heart. "Go down. Plant something that will outlive your fear." The shuttle bays opened on their own. Ancient landers, unused for centuries, powered up with soft, eager sighs. Elias looked at Halric, eyes bright with tears and mischief. "Guess this is where we get off dock." Halric took one last look at the stars that had carried them here, then at the small wooden cross still drifting in the lantern deck, catching the light of a new sun. He smiled, and it was the first expression his face had ever truly owned. "Race you to the surface," he said. They ran. Behind them, the ship that had forgotten its name settled into high orbit and began to sing, low, continuous, patient, a lullaby for a world that had not yet learned to be afraid. And somewhere in the dark between stars, the lattice held, and the vast gentle presence watched its children descend toward soil and sunrise, carrying nothing but scars, songs, and the unshakable conviction that fear had never been the enemy, only the door. The lander touched down in a meadow of silver-blue grass that bent like wheat beneath an alien wind. The ramp lowered with a sigh that sounded almost relieved, as if the machine itself had been holding its breath for centuries. They stepped out barefoot, human and Vaelari together, into soil that had never known a footprint. The air tasted of thunderstorms and crushed mint. 2 moons hung low and full, one bone white, the other the color of old copper, painting the valley in double shadows. Fireflies the size of fists drifted between the grass blades, pulsing soft gold. Halric knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. The ground was warm, alive, humming faintly under his skin like a sleeping animal that had decided to trust him. Elias stood beside him, eyes closed, breathing deep. "Smells like forgiveness," he said. Kira laughed, the sound bright and startled. "You're getting poetic in your old age, Thorn." Old age is a luxury I intend to abuse, he replied and slung an arm around her shoulders. They made camp the way humans always have, badly, noisily, joyfully. Jax and Lur wrestled with a collapsible shelter until it collapsed on them, emerging giggling like children. Mara gathered armfuls of the glowing grass and wove it into crowns that lit their faces from within. Reuben sat on a rock and carved another cross from the branch of a tree that sang when the wind touched it. Halric watched them, chest aching with something too large for the word happiness. Night fell violet and sudden. The fireflies rose in a living aurora, spelling shapes no one could read but everyone understood. They ate around a fire made from fallen branches that burned blue and smelled of cinnamon. Someone passed the tin cup again. Stories began, small ones at first. The worst meal ever eaten on a colony rig, the first time someone saw Earth in a telescope and cried without knowing why, the day Lur's mother taught her to fear feeling. Then the stories grew deeper. A Vaelari medic named Tale told of the quiet rooms, how they strapped you down and played frequencies that erased affection like chalk from a board. How he had volunteered at 17 because he was in love and love was classified a cognitive malfunction. A human pilot named Soren told of holding his co-pilot's hand while the cockpit filled with fire, promising they would meet again on the other side of the dark. No one tried to fix the pain. They simply let it be spoken, let it settle into the soil like seed. When the fire burned low, Mara stood and walked to the center of the circle. She placed the small wooden cross Reuben had carried from the ship upright in the dirt. "This is for everyone we couldn't save," she said, "and everyone we still might." Then she began to sing not the hymn this time, but something older, wordless, rising and falling with the wind in the silver grass. One by one the others joined, voices weaving until the valley itself seemed to breathe with them. Halric felt tears again, familiar now, almost welcome. He looked up. The lattice was visible here, faint but unmistakable, threading between the stars like a promise written in light. He felt the presence settle over the meadow, gentle as snowfall, vast as mercy, a rustle in the grass. They turned as one. Shapes moved at the edge of the firelight, tall, quadrupedal, fur the color of moonlight on water. 6 legs, luminous eyes, antlers that branched like living constellations. They regarded the newcomers without fear, heads tilted in curiosity. Jax whispered local sentience. "No," Halric said, wonder thickening his voice. Older. The creatures stepped fully into the circle. One lowered its great head and touched its muzzle to the wooden cross. The carved wood flared soft gold for a heartbeat, then dimmed. Elias exhaled a laugh that trembled on the edge of tears. "Looks like we've got neighbors." The lead creature, a stag, though the word felt too small, regarded Halric directly. Images flowed into his mind, not words. Welcome, stewardship, remembrance. A memory of this world long empty, waiting. A promise kept. Halric bowed, low and shaking. "We will try to be worthy," he said aloud. The stag dipped its antlers once, solemn, then turned and led its herd back into the dark. The fireflies followed, leaving the camp bathed only in moonglow and starlight. Silence settled, huge and reverent. Kira broke it first. "Well," she said, voice husky, "that's one way to get a welcome wagon." Laughter rippled, soft, inevitable. Later, when most had drifted to sleep beneath woven grass blankets, Halric walked to the edge of the meadow alone. The copper moon painted his skin in blood and bronze. He looked up at the lattice, brighter now, pulsing gently as if keeping time with something enormous and alive. "I was afraid you had left us here to fail," he whispered to the night. The answer came not in words, but in pressure, a hand on the back of his neck, warm, steady, ancient. A shooting star streaked across the sky, trailing silver fire that resolved into letters no alphabet had ever held. "You were never the ones on trial." Halric laughed until he had to sit down in the grass, until the tears came again, until the ache in his chest felt like wings trying to open. Behind him in the camp, someone began to sing again, soft, half asleep, a lullaby from a world none of them would ever see again. The silver grass carried the melody across the valley, and the moons leaned closer to listen. Far above, the Ararat hung in orbit, no longer a warship, no longer a laboratory, just a watchful lantern keeping vigil over the first night of a world learning how to hope. And in the deep places between stars, the lattice tightened, satisfied. The door Fear had opened was still swinging wide, but now they were walking through it together. And the night, for the first time in anyone's memory, was not afraid of the dawn. Years came and went on Ararat the way wind moves through tall grass, quietly, relentlessly, and with purpose. They built no cities. Cities are what frightened people build when they believe stone can outlast sorrow. Instead, they planted. The first spring, Jax and Lur, now inseparable, their hands perpetually stained with soil and starlight, coaxed apple trees from seeds carried in Elias' pocket since New Terra. The trees should not have survived alien gravity, alien sun, alien everything. They did more than survive. They grew 30 feet in a single season, branches heavy with fruit that tasted like childhood and second chances. Mara and Reuben laid outfields of wheat that shimmered silver under the twin moons. When the wind passed through it, the stalks sang in frequencies that calmed nightmares. Children who had never existed yet were already sleeping better because of it. Halric, once terrified of touching anything living, learned the names of every plant by heart. He could be found at dawn kneeling in the dirt, long fingers buried to the wrist, whispering apologies to roots for ever believing life was data. The native herd, the star-antlered ones, came often now. They did not speak, but they listened. When a child fell ill, a stag would appear at the edge of the settlement and lower its head until the fever broke. When two settlers argued until voices cracked, a doe would walk between them, calm as moonlight, and the anger would drain away like water from a broken cup. They called the creatures the Watchers because that was what they did. Watched, waited, remembered for them the things they were still too fragile to hold. 10 years after planetfall, the first child was born under Ararat's sky. They named her Lucia Light. She came into the world during a thunderstorm that rolled across the valley like laughter. Halric caught her with shaking hands while Elias held the mother, a human pilot named Soren who had once promised a dying friend they would meet again on the other side of the dark. Lucia opened her eyes, one human brown, one Vaelari violet, and looked straight at Halric as if she already knew his entire confession. She did not cry, she smiled. And the lattice overhead flared so brightly that for one heartbeat the night became day. Word spread among the Watchers. More came. They stood at the edge of the birthing hut in perfect silence, antlers glowing until dawn. That night the entire settlement gathered around the new family. Someone started singing, of course someone did. Within moments every voice had joined, human and Vaelari braided so tightly you could not tell where one ended and the other began. Lucia slept through it all, tiny fist curled around Halric's finger like she had decided he belonged to her now. He did not argue. 20 years later, the valley was no longer a camp. It was a song made visible. Low houses of living wood and river stone followed the curve of the land like they had grown there. A single road, more path than road, wound between them, paved with stones that warmed under bare feet. At its center stood the original wooden cross, now rooted deep, having sprouted into a tree whose leaves shimmered like the lattice itself. Children, dozens now, human, Vaelari, and every shade between, ran beneath it shouting in a language that had no name yet but already carried pieces of every tongue that had ever prayed. Halric had grown old by Vaelari standards, his skin more gray than blue, but his eyes had never been younger. He spent his days teaching, not science, stories. He told them about the Eidolon, how it had once been a cage and became a cradle. He told them about the void that sang back. He told them about fear and how it was never the enemy, only the messenger. And when the children asked why the Watchers never spoke, he smiled and said, "Because some things are too large for words. They wait until we grow big enough to hear silence." On the 20th anniversary of planetfall, they held the long planting. Every soul on Ararat, over 300 now, walked to the edge of the settled lands carrying a seed, a bulb, a cutting. They walked in silence until they reached an untouched plain where the silver grass grew taller than a man. Their Halric stood on a small rise, older, stooped, radiant. He raised both hands scarred from soil, beautiful. "Today," he said, voice carrying without effort, "we plant what comes after us." One by one they stepped forward. Elias and Kira, gray-haired and still holding hands like teenagers, planted a sapling from the original apple grove. Mara, voice cracked but unbroken, planted lilies that would bloom only on the anniversary of someone's death. Reuben, bent nearly double now, planted a tree whose fruit would feed the hungry long after his bones were dust. Lucia, 20 years old, fierce and kind in equal measure, planted a circle of night-blooming flowers around the spot where her mother had once promised a dying friend they would meet again. When every seed was in the earth, they stood back. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then the Watchers came, hundreds of them stepping out of the tall grass like they had always been there. They moved among the new plantings, touching antler to soil, and where they touched, growth exploded, gentle, green, unstoppable. Within minutes, the plain was a forest. Within an hour, it was old. By sunset, it stretched to the horizon, leaves whispering secrets older than language. Halric stood at the edge of the new woods and felt the presence again, closer now, almost familiar. He did not speak aloud. He didn't need to. The answer came as warmth behind his eyes, as pressure on his heart like a father's hand. Well done. That night they lit no fires. Forest glowed on its own, soft gold and violet, and the lattice overhead descended until it touched the treetops. For one perfect hour, the boundary between earth and heaven dissolved, and every soul on Ararat walked beneath living starlight. Children laughed and chased fireflies the size of lanterns. Old friends embraced and remembered names they had forgotten they knew. The Watchers stood at the edges, antlers blazing, keeping watch not because danger was coming, but because joy this large needed witnesses. Halric found Elias sitting beneath the cross tree, now vast enough to shade half the valley. The old miner looked up, eyes wet. "Think we earned this one, Doc." Halric sat beside him, bones creaking, heart wide open. "No," he said softly, "that's the point." They sat in silence until the lattice began to fade, until the forest dimmed to ordinary moonlight. Elias nudged him. "You ready?" Halric knew what he meant. He was dying, had known for months. The Vaelari lived long but not forever, and his body had carried too much for too long: grief, wonder, apples, children's laughter, the weight of being forgiven. He felt no fear, only readiness. He looked at the forest, at the people moving between the trees like candles, at the watchers standing sentinel, at the stars that had carried them here. Then he looked at Elia's brother, confessor, friend, and smiled the way sunrise smiles at the night. "Race you," he whispered. Elias took his hand. Above them, the cross tree shimmered, and a single leaf detached, drifting down slow as mercy. It landed on Halric's chest just as his eyes closed. And somewhere deeper than death, a door that had once been fear opened wide, and a voice he had first heard in the dark said, gentle as breath, "Welcome home, son. The planting is finished. Now come see the harvest." The day Halric died, the sky over Ararat forgot how to be anything but gold. It began at dawn, a slow, impossible brightening, as though the sun had decided to rise in every direction at once. The twin moons lingered, pale ghosts refusing to leave the party. The lattice, once visible only in moments of greatest grace, now hung low and blazing, a cathedral of living light whose arches touched the horizon. Every soul on the planet felt the pull. They left fields half-harvested, bread half-baked, lovers half-entwined, and walked toward the cross tree. Elias was already there, sitting on the ground beside Halric's body. The old miner had not let go of his friend's hand since the leaf settled. His eyes were red, but dry now, grief too deep for ordinary tears. Lucia arrived first of the younger ones, violet eye and brown eye both wide with the same ancient knowing she had worn the day she was born. She knelt, pressed her forehead to Halric's cooling brow, and whispered something no one else could hear. Then she stood and began to sing, not a hymn. Not a dirge, just his name, over and over, rising and falling like breath. Halric, the forest took it up. The leaves of the cross tree shivered and repeated it in 1,000 rustling voices. The watchers stepped from the tree line, antlers blazing and bowed until their muzzles touched the earth. Halric. The children came running, barefoot and solemn. They laid small gifts at his feet, a carved wooden star, a glowing firefly in a jar, a single perfect apple from the first tree. They did not cry. They understood in the way only children who have never been taught fear can understand. That death was simply another door. Halric. Kira arrived last, moving slow, leaning on a staff carved from the same tree that had once been a broken chair leg on a prison ship. She looked down at the body of the alien who had once tried to break her and felt nothing but tenderness. She placed her hand over Elias where it still held Halric's. "He's not gone," she said, voice rough with love. "He's just early." Elias managed a cracked laugh. Always was a show-off. Above them, the lattice condensed into a single pillar of light that poured straight down through the branches of the cross tree and into Halric's chest. For one impossible heartbeat, the body breathed. Halric's eyes opened, no longer the pale, luminous blue of a Vaelari, but the deep, impossible gold of the sky itself. He looked at them all, every face he had learned to love, every scar he had helped heal, every child he had taught to plant instead of fear, and smiled the way a father smiles when his children finally understand the joke he's been telling their whole lives. "I was wrong," he said, and his voice was everywhere at once, in the wind, in the leaves, in their bones. "Fear does have a bottom." The gathered crowd stilled, waiting. Halric sat up slowly, light pouring from his mouth, his eyes, the seams of his skin. "It ends here," he said, and placed his hand over Elias' heart, in love that refuses to let go. Then he looked up past the lattice, past the sky, past every boundary mortals had ever drawn, and spoke to the one who had been waiting beyond the edge of every map. "I'm ready." The pillar of light flared, gentle, inexorable. Halric's body dissolved, not into nothingness, but into everything. Golden motes rose like reversed rainfall, each one carrying a memory. The first time he laughed, the first time he wept, the first time he knelt in alien soil and meant it. The motes spiraled upward, weaving themselves into the lattice until the entire sky over Ararat became a living tapestry of one man's redeemed life. Where each mote touched the world, something bloomed. A new tree, a new spring, a new child's laughter in the distance. When the last light faded, the sky returned to ordinary blue. But no one who had been there would ever see an ordinary sky again. Elias stood slowly, still holding the hand that was no longer there. He looked at the place where Halric had been and spoke to the empty air. "Told you I'd win the race, you stubborn blue bastard." A breeze answered, warm, smelling of apples and distant thunder. Years later, travelers, human, Vaelari, and species, yet unborn, would come to Ararat looking for the secret of a world that had forgotten how to be afraid. They would find no monuments, no statues, only the cross tree, vast and ancient, its leaves forever gold at the edges, and beneath it, carved into the bark in letters worn soft by countless fingers, one sentence in 100 languages: "He was afraid once, then he loved us anyway." And if they came at dawn, when the light was just right, they might see an old miner and a fierce woman with a staff sitting together on the roots, telling stories to children who listened the way children listen when they already half remember heaven. And sometimes, just sometimes, the wind would carry a laugh that sounded like galaxies learning how to forgive themselves. The lattice never faded again. It simply grew, quiet and patient, stretching from Ararat to every dark corner fear had ever claimed, carrying the same gentle message in every tongue that would ever be spoken. You do not have to be unafraid. You only have to keep walking. And somewhere beyond the edge of seeing, Halric, no longer bound by form, no longer bound by anything but love, walked with them. The experiment was over. The story had just begun. And in the vast, singing silence behind all things, the one who had opened the door in the first place smiled, and closed it gently behind the last fear humanity would ever need, because they had finally learned its true name: home.